All right, so good evening. Thanks to those of you who are joining live. I appreciate it. And those of you who will watch this later, I also appreciate it as well. Welcome to our workshop on global conflict and cooperation. This is a workshop that's focused on defining, exploring, and discussing global conflict and cooperation from the point of view of different international institutions, country governments, and international non-governmental organizations. Our schedule for the fall goes for the entire 16-week term with a break for Thanksgiving. So the first 4 weeks, we discussed particular countries: Afghanistan, Haiti, El Salvador, and Guinea. And then for the following 4 weeks, we talked about, or excuse me, 6 weeks, we talked about different regions of the world. So the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic, and then the Americas. And then today we'll be talking about the country of Sudan. And then for probably the next 3 or 4 weeks, we'll talk about specific countries, and we'll come back to some either general regions or general concepts to wrap it up. If you're interested, you can also watch the recordings from the summer, which introduces this workshop, goes into the concepts of them in more detail and how we operationalize them. And then it goes into either countries or concepts like Afghanistan or climate change. So let me go ahead and jump us to week 11, Sudan. So as you can see here from my Google Earth snapshot, Sudan is located on the African continent, in the eastern part of the continent, surrounded by a number of countries like Chad, Central African Republic, South Sudan, Eritrea, and Egypt, and shares a small border with Libya. Now, our learning objectives with this workshop are the following. First is to identify where the country of Sudan is located. Secondly is to describe the coup d'etat that has occurred in Sudan as of this week. So this is like late breaking news that probably got not covered pretty well because we have a lot of domestic things happening in the United States. But sadly, there was an apparent coup in that country. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll describe, or your third objective is describe the United Nations' integrated transition assistance mission in Sudan. So a little bit about the country of Sudan. Its capital is Khartoum. And you'll see here that the borders of this country. And we have Darfur region in the western part. Some of the major cities. Interestingly enough, this is the country has a port or a seaport. And this is pretty important because it's not essentially landlocked like the country of South Sudan is. And know that both the White Nile River and the Blue Nile River flow through Sudan and on its way towards Egypt. So this is an important part of the world. It has an important geopolitical element to it, given its bordering with Egypt, which has been a large player in the region for decades now, and close to Ethiopia, which has essentially been a good partner to the United States for many years. It's going through its own kind of civil strife right now, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. And then note that it's north of South Sudan, and South Sudan is a newer country. This was established a handful, maybe a few more now years ago, through a civil war, violent conflict between the northern parts and the southern parts of this region. But that's the newest country on earth, is South Sudan. So I'm pretty sure there's still conflict going on, some disputes, but for the most part, now they're two standalone countries. So let's look in a little more detail about Sudan. And we always rely here on the CIA World Factbook. I like using this resource because I feel like it's pretty comprehensive on a whole range of different topics. And so for students who want to unpack what's going on in a country, it's available to you. So I'll post a link in the chat. And have some initial photos of Sudan. And I'm going to go ahead and have this background read to us. Actually, did I lose it? Here. Yes, here. So I'm going to have this read to us, or at least the first two paragraphs, just so we get a sense of what's going on.
The region along the Nile River south of Egypt has long been referred to as Nubia. It was the site of the kingdom of Kerma, which flourished for about a millennium, ca 2500 to 1500 BC, until absorbed into the new kingdom of Egypt. By the 11th century BC, a kingdom of Kush emerged and regained the region's independence from Egypt. It lasted in various forms until the middle of the 4th century AD. After the fall of Kush, the Nubians formed three Christian kingdoms of Nobatia, Makuria, and Alodia, the latter two endured until around 1500. Between the 14th and 15th centuries, much of Sudan was settled by Arab nomads, and between the 16th to 19th centuries it underwent extensive Islamization. Egyptian occupation early in the 19th century was overthrown by a native Mahdist Sudan state, 1885-99, that was crushed by the British, who then set up an Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, nominally a condominium, but in effect a British colony. Following independence from Anglo-Egyptian co-rule in 1956, military regimes favoring Islamic-oriented governments have dominated national politics. Sudan was embroiled in two prolonged civil wars during most of the remainder of the 20th century. These conflicts were rooted in northern economic, political, and social domination of largely non-Muslim, non-Arab southern Sudanese. The first civil war ended in 1972, but another broke out in 1983. Peace talks gained momentum in 2002-04 with the signing of several accords. The final North/South Comprehensive Peace Agreement, CPA, signed in January 2005, granted the Southern rebels autonomy for 6 years, followed by a referendum on independence for Southern Sudan. The referendum was held in January 2011 and indicated overwhelming support for independence. South Sudan became independent on July 9, 2011. Sudan and South Sudan have yet to fully implement security and economic agreements signed in September 2012 relating to the normalization of relations between the two countries. The final disposition of the contested Abaya region has also to be decided. The 30-year reign of President Umar Hassan Ahmad al-Bashir ended in his ouster in April 2019, and a Sovereignty Council, a joint civilian-military executive body, holds power as of November 2001.
Actually, I'm going to have it play the next paragraph too, because I think it gives really important context. So we'll just have it go all the way through.
Following South Sudan's independence, conflict broke out between the government and the Sudan People's Liberation Movement North in southern Kordofan and Blue Nile states, together known as the Two Areas, resulting in a humanitarian crisis affecting more than 1 million people. An earlier conflict that broke out in the western region of Darfur in 2003 displaced nearly 2 million people and caused thousands of deaths. While some repatriation has taken place, about 1.83 million IDPs remain in Sudan as of May 2019. Fighting in both the Two Areas and Darfur between government forces and opposition has largely subsided. However, the civilian populations are affected by low-level violence, including intertribal conflict and banditry, largely a result of weak rule of law. The UN and the African Union have jointly commanded a Darfur peacekeeping operation, UNAMID, since 2007, but are slowly drawing down as the situation in Darfur becomes more stable. Sudan also has faced refugee influxes from neighboring countries, primarily Ethiopia, Eritrea, Chad, Central African Republic, and South Sudan. Armed conflict, poor transport infrastructure, and denial of access by both the government and armed opposition have impeded the provision of humanitarian assistance to affected populations. However, Sudan's new transitional government has stated its priority to allow greater humanitarian access as the food security and humanitarian situation in Sudan worsens and as it appeals to the West for greater engagement. On January 6, 2021, Sudan signed the US-sponsored Abraham Accords, normalizing ties with Israel and becoming the fourth Arab country to do so after Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Morocco in 2002.
So that gives us a pretty healthy overview of the country and its long-term history. And I think the two important things to point out is that it used to be an extension of Egypt, and obviously that changed some time ago. And then it was colonized by the British and kind of emphasized this religious element of Christianity compared to Islamic or Islamicism. And so we see that religious kind of faction led to this, or partially contributed to the conflict that we saw between the northern and southern parts of the country. And then we hear about how they kind of worked through that civil war. I say work through it, like they fought through a civil war. People got injured and hurt and killed, but eventually, you know, with both internal and then external supports, kind of worked through that conflict and eventually reached a resolution of allowing this part of the country to declare autonomy or obtain autonomy and then become its own country. So we get a sense like things are pretty good, right? That there isn't other mentions here of like conflict or civil strife or anything else up to this point. But things aren't that case, especially in the past week as we started hearing about this in the news. So let's go ahead and jump to our conflict portion of this. And I'm going to go ahead and open up this link to Sudan Prime Minister detained in a military coup. And we'll go ahead and watch a short video offered by PBS NewsHour that talks about this. So we'll go ahead and get this set up and we'll let it play. And if you just give me a thumbs up once the audio starts.
In the day's other news, Moderna says that its half-dose COVID-19 vaccine is safe and effective for children ages 6 to 11. That comes as FDA advisors prepare to meet tomorrow on land recently in an apparent coup, detaining the country's prime minister and deposing a governing council that included civilian leaders. As news of the takeover spread, thousands of protesters filled the streets to demonstrate against a return to authoritarian rule. The Sudanese Doctors Association reported security forces fired on crowds, killing at least 7 protesters and wounding 140 others. On the streets of Khartoum today, protesters shouted the country belongs to them, rejecting a return to autocratic rule.
They arrested the ministers. They detained members of the Sovereign Council. This is a full-fledged coup, and we reject it completely.
Demonstrators burned tires and blocked main roads after the military seized power from a transitional government. In a televised address today, the military's top general, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, declared a state of emergency. He said a new government would lead the country until elections in 2023.
Let's all work to improve people's lives and ensure their safety and security, and to create the suitable environment for political parties in order to reach a specified date for elections.
In a Facebook post earlier today, Sudan's information ministry said military forces pressured Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok to release a pro-coup statement. When he refused, the ministry said Hamdok was moved to an unknown location. Soon after, the ministry announced internet connections had been cut from the country's mobile phone networks. In a statement today, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres condemned, quote, the ongoing military coup d'etat and all actions that could jeopardize Sudan's political transition and stability. In 2019, after months of protests, thousands celebrated the overthrow of Sudan's longtime autocratic leader and accused war criminal Omar al-Bashir. Military and civilian leaders created a transitional government to lead the country to democracy for the first time in 3 decades. For months, Sudan's transitional government was under threat of military coup. A failed coup plot last month set off infighting between military and civilian groups. The U.S. State Department reacted to these events by announcing it is suspending $700 million in emergency economic aid to Sudan. The funds were supposed to be used to help Sudan transition to a full.
And so there we get a sense of what's gone on, right? That the military and civilian factions of the country came to an agreement after they ousted the longtime leader. And it was probably tenuous at best. And there's probably factions within the factions that wanted power and they're competing for it. And now eventually it's spilled over to seeing the military take over. So this is a very clear example of conflict and of internal conflict. Now, to the extent that it becomes a civil war where there's 2 sides and they start to attack or maim or kill each other at higher numbers remains to be seen. Hopefully that doesn't happen, that cooler heads prevail, but it's potentially the beginnings of that kind of conflict. Knowing that the country's gone through that before, obviously with its southern region, I don't know what the appetite is for having that type of conflict going forward, but just know that anytime you see a disruption of political system, there's going to be people on all sides of that argument who would want to take it to its sadly logical extremes, which is violence. So hopefully that doesn't happen, but we'll see how this unfolds over the coming weeks and months. Now, when it comes to conflict, as you heard at the end of that clip, that the U.S. halting aid to the Sudan government, what I want to do is just open up this article in the New York Times that talks about this cutting of aid. And it's important to note that aid is an example of cooperation. And now in this case, because there's instability or a military takeover, that the United States is saying, well, we're not going to support that effort. So we're not going to cooperate anymore with the government of Sudan because we don't know who the government of Sudan is, or that they came about through non-democratic means. And so we'll go ahead and listen to this short clip about the U.S. freezing almost $1 billion in aid to the country.
The United States condemns the actions taken overnight by Sudanese military forces. The arrest of civilian government officials and other political leaders, including Prime Minister Hamdok, undermines the country's transition to democratic civilian rule. The civilian-led transitional government should be immediately restored. It represents the will of the Sudanese people, as evidenced by the significant, peaceful demonstrations of support on October 21st. Military officials should immediately release and ensure the safety of all detained political actors, fully restore the civilian-led transitional government, and refrain from any violence against protesters, including the use of live ammunition. Any change to the transitional government by force risks assistance in our bilateral relationship more broadly. In light of these developments, the United States is pausing assistance from the $700 million in emergency assistance appropriations of economic support funds for Sudan. Those funds were intended to support the country's democratic transition as we evaluate the next step for Sudan programming.
So there you heard from a State Department official that the United States was supporting. No, pause that. That the United States was supporting this transition, right? And $700 million is nothing to scoff at. Like, that's a lot of money. And it goes a long way in other parts of the world. And so knowing that they don't have that aid, the real question is now the military leaders who've led this coup, where are they going to find their financial support? And obviously you can look to like a local economy and like tax revenues and other things. But once you disrupt society in a way like that, people aren't going to be like, oh yeah, I'm going to just keep paying my taxes, or I'm going to keep contributing to the economy. If anything, people will kind of hide and go into shelter because they don't know what to expect next. And by the United States, and I want to just point out one other thing, his language is very careful, right? He didn't say we're stopping or we're ending. He says we're pausing. And what he's basically saying is, like, pausing is a softer word, and it's and it basically gives an option for the United States to continue it or to maybe try to find another remedy around it. So it doesn't want to make it seem like it's retracting that money and they're going to put it to other use, like, because when you have $700 million saying it's not going that way, that's a lot of leverage for the United States or and other countries who might have an interest in Sudan or in the region to say, well, we're going to pause our money too. So what could have been tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars flowing into that country on an annual or maybe on a monthly basis isn't anymore. The military coup leaders are going to have to think long and hard, like, okay, well, how do we finance this whole thing? Unless they have stores of gold bars or something they're going to use, but we don't know about that. So last part is the implications. And I just want to share, back in 2020, the Security Council of the United Nations established what's called the Integrated Transition Assistance Mission in Sudan, and they adopted a resolution unanimously to support it. So let me go ahead and open this up, and we'll listen to what that's about.
The Security Council, in a June 4th video conference meeting decided to establish a new political mission in Sudan to assist the country in its transition towards democratic governance, provide support for peace negotiations, and bolster efforts to maintain accountable rule of law and security institutions. Unanimously adopting Resolution 2524, 2020, the Council decided that the new United Nations Integrated Transition Assistance Mission in Sudan, UNITAMS, will provide technical assistance to the constitution drafting process, supporting implementation of all human rights, equality, accountability, and rule of law provisions in the constitutional document. Among other strategic objectives, UNITAMS will provide good offices for peace negotiations, and if requested, scalable support for the implementation of any future peace agreements, and for the monitoring and verification of possible ceasefires, with particular focus on Blue Nile and South Kordofan, the two areas, and Darfur. By other terms, the new mission will also assist in peacebuilding, civilian protection, and rule of law, notably in Darfur and the two areas. It will support Sudan's capacity to extend state presence and inclusive civilian governance, in particular by strengthening accountable rule of law and security institutions, and by building trust between state authorities and local communities. To foster stable conditions in which future peace agreements can be implemented, UNITAMS will provide support on civilian protection, deploying mobile monitoring teams and facilitating local crisis mediation. It will also help to uphold human rights, notably by protecting women and children from sexual and gender-based violence. It will collaborate with international financial institutions to mobilize economic and development assistance and facilitate full, rapid, and unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid. The Council requested the Secretary-General to swiftly establish UNITAMS, ensuring that the mission can start delivering against all its strategic objectives no later than January 1, 2021. He was also requested to provide the Council with a suggested structure and geographical deployment within 60 days.
So there you saw, or we heard about how the United Nations was basically facilitating an effort by itself, but also probably with partner or member countries to support this transition from an authoritarian system to a democratic system. And what was really interesting there to hear was like they're going to help this was at the beginning of the year, help folks write a constitution that would enshrine things like human rights, democratic processes, full, free and fair elections, and things of that nature. And so it's like the world community was working to support this, and then now 10 months, not almost 11 months into this year, saying, there's this coup. So it's like, what's going on? What happened? So there's a lot of questions that can come around from this. And it's just one of the many implications. It's like, what does it mean now for the UN's engagement with the region or with the country itself? So with that, we'll go ahead and stop the recording and get to our discussion. Thanks to those of you who took the time to listen. I appreciate it, and have a great night.